Michael, before we went to commercial break, you were kind of framing what has happened in Cuba. Of course, there were those massive protests of July 11th, 2021. There has been more protests recently in the last few months. Have things worsened since the initial wave of arrests, following the July protests, the July pro-democracy protests of 2021? Do you feel that the situation with the government, the situation for the pro-democracy freedom fighters has worsened, Michael?
Yes, it has worsened, and that's one of the reasons why people are protesting in Cuba. They're protesting against the brutal repression that has taken place since July 11. Cuba now has more repression, and levels of repression are higher than in the past 2 decades. So they're responding to police abuse. That's one of the main triggers of the protest. There was recently a group of Cubans that tried to leave Cuba in a boat. 23 of them, and 7 were killed by the Coast Guard. And that was October 28th, including a 2-year-old who was killed in that. It was intentionally from the Coast Guard to ram the boat and kill them. So that triggered protests in Bahia Honda, which is in Havana province. The situation in prisons are terrible. There are NGOs like Prisoner Defenders that have reported torture. Political prisoners are subjected to different types of tortures in prison. And that was a report sent to the United Nations working group on torture. So the conditions of people, the repression instead of silencing protests is getting more people to protest in Cuba. There's a culture of protest. People understand that without pressure, there is no change. So that's why they are taking to the streets. And even though there are particular triggers like a national blackout after Hurricane Ian hit Cuba, when you hear what people are asking in the protest, the way they are conducting the protest in front of the different Communist Party headquarters in the different localities across Cuba, you realize there is a political intentions in the protest, that people want democracy, that they want freedom. They understand that only by changing the system that their lives would improve.
Sarah, I want to bring you into the conversation. You're an international human rights lawyer. What you're seeing in Cuba, I mean, we see protests around the world. We've seen Iran. We've seen what's happening, obviously, with the invasion in Ukraine. We've seen in other jurisdictions in China. We don't hear as much about Cuba. We did initially, but we in July 2021, but we don't hear as much. Why is that?
It's a good question. I think a lot of it has to do with sort of media, public awareness. Cuba sort of is, maybe part of it is Cuba is seen as like a small foe, if that. But then what's missing from the conversation are these links to Russia and China.
Right. And now you've outlined, and I know you've published some work, and as well as Michael here, on some of the troubling alliances that Cuba has fostered, and you name like Russia and China. Explain, why, say, for example, an alliance with China is a concern. Sarah.
Right. So, I mean, in general, there's a growing collaboration and alliances between autocracies around the world. And we see that not just with Cuba, but more broadly. And when it comes to China, so China controls a lot of the tech infrastructure in Cuba. And sort of in exchange, we see Cuba parroting CCP talking points in international fora. We see Cuba borrowing methods of repression that the CCP has long employed, like internet censorship and shutdown. So there's a collaboration and information sharing and a mutual support in these international institutions that's really, really troubling.
And with Russia, where's the collaboration? Where do you see that collaboration going?
So, I mean, it's similar. Cuba has been supportive of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and international institutions. And that support, goes both ways. We also see that, I've talked about China and Russia, but there's also Iran. Iran has loaned Cuba a lot of money, and they've leveraged that for influence as well. There were reports a while back of Iran using Cuba as a launching pad to do a cyber attack against the U.S. There's alliances with Venezuela, whereby Cuban officials are actually training Venezuelan military in their repression of the Venezuelan people. So it's also broader than just China and Russia.
My goodness, what you described there is, it's a very unholy alliance, a very troubling alliance if you have all these authoritarian regimes coming together and acting as a bloc. We have seen this in the past, of course, but in the 21st century, who thought?